Ladies and gentlemen, good morning. I'm Doug Silliman, the president of the Arab Gulf States Institute, and I'm very happy to welcome all of you here to the Army-Navy Club in Washington, D.C. for the 10th annual AGSIW Petro Diplomacy Conference. For those of you watching on our webcast, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you might be. We're happy that you've joined us virtually, and I hope that this conversation will be worth your time today. Petro Diplomacy is really the event that launched AGSI 10 years ago in 2015. So it is fitting that as we come up to our 10th anniversary early next year, this is one of our centerpieces of our work and what we are doing. And in Petro Diplomacy, we've always tried to mix different pieces of the energy environment. We talk about markets, but we talk about politics. We talk about political activism, and we try to make sure that we see the ways in which all these pieces fit together or don't fit together that will come to affect politics, energy, and economics going forward. This year, there are a lot of things to talk about, and we are going to focus really on 4 areas in our program this morning. The first is the broad future of fossil fuels. At last year's COP28, a lot of issues came up, a lot of contradictions as well. One UN official declared after COP28 that this was the beginning of the end for fossil fuels, while at just about the same time, OPEC said that there needed to be more upstream investment in hydrocarbons to make sure that the world did not run out of oil before energy transition was completed. Today we're going to talk about particularly what the Gulf states are doing and how these contradictions are going to work out both in politics and in markets going forward. The second thing we're going to talk about is the future of natural gas and maybe more specifically the future of LNG. A lot of global events are affecting this, not the least of which is the continued conflict in Ukraine. But there's a lot of doubt about whether or not LNG can be a transitional fuel, whether it's going to be a destination fuel for parts of the world, including in the global south. So again, we'll ask, what is the future of natural gas, and what is the role of Gulf states in particular in natural gas going forward? Third, we're going to talk about financing the transition. At COP28, CEO Sultan Al-Jaber said that the world must invest $6 trillion in renewable energy between now and 2030 in order to have any chance of meeting the 1.5 degrees Celsius targets on climate change, and then said the world's not going to meet that target. There's not enough financing available for the transition. Some policy changes, like the Inflation Reduction Act in the United States, have brought in a lot of money, but the bigger questions will be, what does the United States do with that money? How will Europe finance its energy transition? What is the Gulf doing and how will they transition? And then at the end, how will the global south transition to new energy systems? Again, we'll talk about that and the role of the Gulf today. And finally, geopolitics. This year in particular, political issues and conflict have really raised the stakes for the discussions of energy markets. The Israel-Hamas war in Gaza has certainly sent shockwaves through the region politically. It has not yet disrupted markets, although there are factors that could do that. But will Gaza, will Yemen, will Ukraine, will Taiwan and the South China Sea complicate the energy transition? And what will be the role of China, Russia, or the Gulf and other international players in energy markets going forward? So we'll hear today from experts, from diplomats, we'll hear from the private sector, from academia, and we hope this will be a lively discussion among this group because all of you are experts in these areas and we want to make sure this is as participatory as possible. Before we launch into the program, though, I want to thank 2 people. First, I want to thank on my left, AGSIW non-resident fellow Dave DeRoche, who for I think the 3rd time has secured for us the Army-Navy Club as a great venue. Dave, you are a mensch, a gentleman, a scholar, and a good friend to be into the Institute. And a member. Second, I want to really deeply thank another AGSIW non-resident fellow, Kate Dourian, who is the godmother, the inspiration for this entire conference. She has put together the agenda, written the scene setter, not just for this conference, but pretty much for all of the conferences going back for the past decade. Kate, without your work on this, there wouldn't be a Petro Diplomacy conference. We'll hear from Kate in the next few minutes and throughout the conference as well. So we want to start this conference with a broad discussion of energy issues with two real experts. To my right, we have Roger Diwan, who is Vice President at S&P Global Commodity Insights, where he, as he has done throughout his career, provided advice about energy and energy markets to the finance world. He was formerly VP of Financial Services at IHS Markit, and before that a partner at PFC Energy. And I will say I've never come out of a conversation with Roger where I did not feel smarter about energy and money and life in general. So I'm very happy to have you here today, Roger. And moderating this discussion is Kate Dourian. I told you you'd hear from her soon. In addition to being an AGSI non-resident fellow, she's a contributing editor to the Middle East Economic Survey and a fellow at the Energy Institute. She was previously the regional manager for the Middle East for the World Energy Council and started her career as a journalist. So, Kate, thank you for everything. A lot of this is due to you, but we want to hand you the microphone and let you get started.
And I figured it out, I think, yes. Good morning, everybody, and thank you for being here. I was in Dubai when the storms hit in April, and my street was flooded. And I had ducks swimming in the water because they thought, hey, it's a new lake. You know, we're having a great time. I actually filmed it because it was so funny. But it sort of felt apocalyptic. It felt like the end of days, you know, and this was just a few months after we'd had COP28, which is what really we're talking about, you know, the beginning of the end of fossil fuels. But we're always talking percentages about how much we use today. You know, 80% of the global energy mix is oil, is fossil fuels. The rest is, you know, a combination of clean energy, renewable energy, etc. And there's one number, you know, percentages don't really tell you the story. And there's one number that really struck me. It was Sultan Jaber speaking before COP28. And he said, you know, we are using today the equivalent of 250 million barrels of oil, gas, and coal. And the question is, you know, how do you transition? How can you say it's the end of fossil fuels? And like, you know, and the IEA keeps saying, my former employers insist that we are going to see a peak in demand for all fossil fuels by 2030, which sounds a bit optimistic. Maybe oil, and I think Roger has a few ideas about that because we're seeing mobility, you know, in the transportation sector. We're seeing a decline in demand, particularly in China. We're seeing a lot more gas that's due to come online. So, you know, and that's going to be the second half of this decade. So I think there's a lot of things to discuss, and I'm going to leave it to the real experts to tell us about how he sees the transition. And of course, our focus is going to be on how the Gulf states, which generally are pretty reliant on oil export revenues and gas export revenues in the case of countries like Qatar, and how they're managing, because if I look at the latest investment report, again, by the IEA, they don't really feature that highly, even though they do have these mega projects, you know, solar projects. Now we even have Bahrain with offshore wind. So I'm going to hand it over to Roger to give us a sort of overall picture of how the transition is actually being managed by these basically petrostates. Roger.
All right, good morning. Big responsibility here. The way I like to think about the big picture, in a way, is there is a narrative going on in the energy world. And the narrative, I would say, every year is set up by a few events. Obviously, COP is kind of central to understand what the industry is thinking, where we are. There is Davos, where I think there's a lot of discussion around that. And then there is Sierra Week in the spring, and then there is ADIPEC in October. And around these events, in a way, certain narratives emerges and become the debate. And obviously events and reality through the year reset the narratives. But I think these moments are important to understand where we are into these discussions. And the debate around the transition and what we're thinking about the transition has been evolving quite a lot in the last year. I mean, between the COP and what the COP achieved and how it was run in the UAE, etc., was a very important moment to reset the discussion. And the discussion has now came that the tone has shifted in emphasis, and now we're really much closer to we're going to need all of the above with conditionality, but really it's all of the above, and that the energy security aspect of the energy world, in a way, has reset the debate compared to where we were between, I would say, just pre-COVID, post-COVID. And a different set of realities have emerged, and so we can go through some of them. But in a way, we understand that this transition is going to move in different direction at very different speeds. Some countries are going to be able to accelerate it, some are behind. Financing will be available in some places and not others. So it's like multi-dimensional, and it means that to grasp it in one nice, tight bundle is very difficult. The energy security rehabilitation, if you want, of oil and gas in particular, let's call, and understanding that both of them will be necessary, complementary, but also these industries are going to have to do certain things. The second big theme for the oil and gas is they need to decarbonize. And they need to decarbonize fast to continue to have a license to operate into the transition. And there's different dimension on it, but I'll give you an anecdote. So we try to represent the whole industry when we put the program at CERAWeek. 2 years ago, we had, I would say, something like 12 or 14 panels on Upstream. Last year, of the 12 we had, 9 were talking about decarbonization. And it was not a personal choice. It was a choice of the companies who wants to come and talk. So that's what they want to emphasize, and that's where they're spending a lot of money. So that decarbonization element is really important. The methane in particular, and the methane pledge, basically the large oil and gas company, national and international IOCs, have pledged to remove methane at a very fast speed, basically before the end of the decade, to get most of the methane they emit out of the system. It's a big deal. It's a gas which is really damaging, and we have the technology and the ability to do it. I think we managed to put 8 of the 9 largest companies in a room and having them discuss what they're doing around methane, and that's a big deal. And in a way, the COP was a success there, and that's one element that the industry is trying to move on very fast. It's key for oil, but it's also key for LNG. In the US, if you want to export to Europe, I think you're going to have to really control methane and your carbon emission. The same in the Gulf. All the Gulf countries are looking at really reducing the methane and carbon content of their LNG to continue to have that license to export. So that second theme is, okay, all of the above, oil and gas is part of the transition, but oil and gas needs to do its part. The difficult part is the carbon capture side, where the technology is early. We haven't proved it at a large scale. Some areas are making progress, but we don't have big carbon management systems in place. The costs are very high. The technology is not proven completely. So that is a problem for the industry. The decarbonization is slow. So the decarbonizing molecule is moving at a slow pace, and that's a problem. So the methane side is what can go faster, but it's not going to be enough. And finally, the direct air capture is really at the beginning, and that's going to require at least 10, 15 more years to get into a cost which is palatable. Even if we reduce it by 50%, we're going to be still uneconomical. So these two elements were really important, I think, into the overall discussion. Gas's role, I think, is pretty secure. We can talk about oil and oil demand maybe in a follow-up, but the role of gas, I think, is pretty secure. You need it for two very important reasons. You need it to balance the power systems. When you have a lot of intermittent power that you're adding to the grid, and we're adding them at an incredibly fast pace, you're going to need something to help you firm the grid, and gas will play that role. So we might have more capacity, but maybe less demand, but we don't have gas peaking really until the mid-30s in our forecast, and after that, it doesn't really decline. It seems to be a long, long plateau. The other reason you need gas is if you want to decarbonize Asia and remove coal, gas is your only option, really, at the scale that you need it. So the notion that you would be able to bypass gas in Asia and get to something else is just not realistic. I mean, we're talking here 4 or 5 billion of people are going to need energy, and it's going to take time to make it non-hydrocarbon. So I think that ensure that, and there is a real, I think, realism about that that is important. I'll stop here, but maybe we...
Yeah, no, I was actually going... You just mentioned CERAWeek, and I noticed that usually in the past you used to have a lot of ministers from the Gulf. You didn't this time around, but you did have, I mean, Nasser speaking about, you know, the fact that the industry in general is being demonized, that, you know, they're being told to keep it in the ground, but at the same time there's this decline rate, and you're going to have more demand, particularly from emerging, you know, developing countries and they're getting a very, very small percentage. I think it's 15% of total of that 2 trillion in renewable energy and clean energy that the IEA says is going to be invested this year. They're only getting about 15% of it. So how can you ensure that the transition is, you know, is fair, is affordable? And that's the other thing. You mentioned all these technologies. Somebody has to pay for them. Somebody has to pay for the fact that your sustainable aviation fuel, which you've got new mandates coming into effect in Europe next year, are going to cost passengers more money. You've seen what's happened with the European parliamentary elections. These are anti-climate parties. These are anti-immigrant parties. These are going to probably, I mean, the transition has to be policy-led, right? It's got to be policy-led. So if you've got...
It is.
If you've got these parties that are opposed to the transition, who actually don't believe in climate change, I mean, that's certainly going to have an impact. But at the same time, when it comes to the Gulf states, I mean, you see what Nasser said at your conference about the industry. We saw the Secretary General of OPEC before COP28 was writing to members saying, you know, you've got to fight this, you know. And then later on, he wrote this sort of apocalyptic article that was published on the website saying the world would actually come to an end if we stopped oil today. And in a way, he's right. I mean, you know, there are some points to be made, because you're still talking about, and not only that, as we electrify, and I think we're going to be talking about it in other sessions, as we're electrifying, because at the end of the day, renewables is really about electrification mainly, we're going to need more power. And I think my colleague Robin Mills wrote an excellent piece recently about the amounts that are being invested in grids, in storage. So I think it seems to me as if we have to decarbonize so many different sectors all at once, and there's going to be a cost element, and you need the funding. So where's that going to come from?
I'll break down this in a few pieces. There is an oil debate, and I'll come to it in a second. There is a molecule versus electron discussion that I think is very important to put that on the table. And there's a policy one. So I can divide it in three. Let's start with the oil discussion. So Sierra Week was interesting. We didn't have a lot of Arab ministers, and the reason is we're in the middle of Ramadan. It was the first week of Ramadan. Actually, it's worse. And next year, actually, in the third week of Ramadan, which is it's a really problem to have a large delegation from the Middle East during Ramadan. But we had two speeches, actually. We had Amin Nasser, and we had Sultan Al-Jaber through a video. And we had some African minister member of OPEC. And what you see, actually, and you had some large consumers in the room, importantly. For example, the largest refiner in the world, Sinopec, to also give his view. I think we need the view of the consumers and the producers of oil, I'm talking about here. And there's a real debate about where oil is. And I think both Amin Nasser and the Secretary General of OPEC have, particularly Secretary General of OPEC, taken a side of the debate, which is interesting. What happens if there's no oil? Nobody's talking about that, but we can create a fake narrative if needed. I don't know a lot of governments who are banning oil, so I don't know where that comes from, correct? But you listen to Sultan Al-Jaber and you listen to Amin Nasser, and there is a lot of space between them. Which is interesting is how much you want to decarbonize, how fast you want to transition. After all, even within that debate, it's the UAE which is increasing production, not Saudi Arabia. So let's keep the thing in context. But it's clear that that debate around the future of oil now has, within the producer group, different nuances. And those are managed, and managed well, I would say, if you look at the latest OPEC agreement between price and volume and the length of the transition, etc., and at what price we need to continue to produce. We've been in an oil market in the last 4 years in a remarkably narrow band, despite the fact of many, many crises. So the system has worked. The system has been well managed. We have to say that. And that price, by the way, anything between 75 and 90, and maybe a little bit lower going forward, if that agreement holds the way that they design it. So favoring, I would say, overall growth in market share rather than just prices. That's the Goldilocks prices for the oil industry. I mean, at these prices, we've seen the capex of the oil and gas industry rebounding. This year we'll be spending in 2024 about $640 billion in the upstream. That's plenty enough to continue to grow, so we don't have a financing problem. When you look at the IOCs, only 50% of their cash flow is going into capex. They have 50% to give back to shareholders. This is as rich as it gets. So the oil and gas industry doesn't have a financing problem really anymore in this price band, and everything above 70 would keep you there. If you look at the next 7-8 years of project coming online, you have almost everything you need already approved and under construction to meet that demand, and we have spare capacity into the system. So we're in good shape. We have managed to get the industry in the right place with 2 or 3 good years, really. And if you stay there, you can finance both the oil and gas that you need. Remember, the oil system is a declining system, correct? So you can't stay flat. We believe that you need to spend about $500 billion a year to stay flat. So it takes quite a lot. But the cash flow generated by the industry is multiples of that. So it can self-finance to a large degree. Doesn't mean everybody can self-finance, but the cash flow is very big at these prices for a system of 100 million barrel. The debate, in a way, I think has shifted, is not anymore on the supply side and how do we finance supply, is the debate about where is demand. Because if demand is rising in the next 7 years, 10 years, or flat or declining, give you a very different amount of money you need to spend and where do you need to produce. And I think there is a healthy debate about where demand is moving. Just to give you the three positions, OPEC believes basically oil demand will continue to grow, doesn't have a peak, continue to grow slowly but surely, even in the 40s and even in the 40s. The IEA has really gone the other way. So just I'll give you the 2030 numbers, which is the closest and what we know we should be able to forecast the best. We're about at 104 million barrels per day now. The IEA believes that by the end of the decade we'll be slightly below that or about that level. OPEC believe we'll be at 112 plus million barrels per day, so 8 million gap between both of them, which is we never had any gap like that. 3 years ago they were at the same level. And S&P were at 108, so we're kind of somewhere in between. We believe that demand will continue to grow this decade for liquids, will peak about 2031, plateau for some time, and then start to decline. The more important element, I think, at least in our forecast, I'm not going to debate a lot their forecast, is that our product demand for the main product, gasoline, diesel, etc., is really peaking later into this decade, by 2027, 2028. And that is really important because what we're seeing is that the growth of gasoline, diesel, jet fuel, etc., is really slowing down structurally because of the emergence of other fuels, biofuels, e-fuels, but also obviously the EV growth around the world and particularly in China.
You mentioned EV growth, but I mean, we're seeing a decline in sales in the US and maybe not so much in China because they do it more cheaply, but then at the same time we're having this a lot of trade disputes, tariffs on Chinese EVs. Europe is considering it. I mean, is that going to, again, raise costs? Because if you know, it means you're not going to have this sort of transition in the transportation sector, which is really the easiest one. So road transportation is the easiest one, maybe not so much heavy transportation, maybe not so much shipping, and aviation is going to take a lot longer. But we seem to have this habit, and I think particularly in Europe, and when I was at the IEA, we had these targets that were set by the EU. Of course, they missed them, and they set an even higher target. And, you know, you sort of keep going on. It's a vicious circle. But when I talk to people in the industry, it's sort of, you know, when we're talking about these new, cleaner energy vectors, you know, we're talking green hydrogen, we're talking blue ammonia. You talk to Amin Nasser and he'll say, I can't do it now. The cost has to come down because I can't find off-takers at this price. So it's a very complicated issue. And what has come out is that they still need revenues from the oil and gas in order to drive the transition, particularly in the Gulf states, because they can't afford to, at this time, get lower rents because it's socially disruptive, and particularly at a time when we are seeing a lot of geopolitical risk in the region. However, interestingly, and this is something, I mean, both of us have been doing this for a long time, we've been at OPEC meetings. Normally, if you have the kind of geopolitical shock that we've had because of the Gaza war, because of Ukraine, you would see prices shoot up. I'm looking at it now, it's sort of 81.5 a barrel. It hasn't really had an impact. And why is that? Why is geopolitics no longer being having influence on the price of oil?
Okay, let's start with the EV side. I think the EV discussion in the United States is really tainted in the United States by the politics around EV in the United States. It's the only place in the world where we decided what the engine of your car is a political discussion, which is absurd. The question is the technology. And and the cost of the technology. So yes, EV sales in the United States have kind of plateaued. They're still growing in Europe. And I looked at, to give you a sense of how things change, our forecast in 2019 for EV sales in the world, in 2021, and in 2023. And basically, in 2019, we thought that EV sales will reach 30% of the global fleet by something 2036. And now we believe that is probably in 2028. So shows you how things are moving faster. And they're moving faster mostly because of one country decided to shift to this new technology, which is China. So if you look at the three largest EV markets in the world, they are China, the US, and who the third? Chinese exports. Okay? So we spend every month looking at all the Chinese export, and they put them only by vehicle model. So we have to match that to the train of each car. And they're rising very, very fast. And speaking to my colleagues in Beijing who spend 3 weeks at the auto show in Beijing, and I think this is the place we need to be, not at the OPEC meeting, because this is where it's happening. The amount of models, the range, the battery, the technology. I mean, electric cars are a better technology. It's just going to take time, but it is. That's the reality. It's easier to manufacture. It's cheaper to manufacture. They can include much more electronics, etc. So it's moving that direction. We can debate the speed at which it's moving, but the fact that China suddenly is going hockey stick in terms of its EV manufacturing is a revolution that is happening now, not 2 years ago, but now. For example, our forecast for Chinese EV sales penetration, we had them reach 40% by something like 2028. This year, they're likely to reach 50%. Okay? Basically, light vehicle with ICE engine in China have peaked. And when you listen to the CEO of Sinopec, tells you gasoline demand is peaking as we speak. So for Gulf countries who are always said like our savior is going to be China, demand is going to grow forever and ever and ever, it's just not happening. The reality is not there. Same happening with diesel. The truck fleet, the bus fleet is being moved to electricity or to gas or to LNG or to hydrogen in China, and they're exporting it. So not to the United States, to Europe, but also to the rest of the world. Why do you think Ethiopia has banned import of gasoline cars now? So you're starting to see that manufacturing power of China applied to the energy transition. So EV and car is one element, the other one is solar, and we can talk about that. And this is, I think, a fundamental element that we need to understand better, that speed going on between what I would call the molecule world and the electron world. And in the electron world, it's manufacturing. In the molecule world is extraction. We're talking about very different timelines. And adding manufacturing lines and infrastructure for manufacturing lines, it's a lot faster, and the cost continued to come down severely. I mean, in the last 10 years, EV battery cost is down 80%, solar panel down 90%. So when you look at the capital spending is rising for all these renewable technologies, not very fast, but the cost decline is such that if you're increasing capital by 10%, you're increasing production by 30%. So that capital efficiency is really important because it denies, in a way, all these forecasts will show also that capital needs to go at an incredible rate. We do, but in a way what we're managing to do with the capital efficiency, which is also happening on the oil side, by the way, is really important in the transition. The one area where costs are still high and rising is decarbonization, it's hydrogen, it's offshore wind, but offshore wind not everywhere. In China, costs are coming down very fast. They can manufacture them faster, install them faster, etc. And on the electron side, we have something very important. We have the technology is moving fast because we're moving into the technology world. The grid enhancing technologies, how to manage demand, better cables. So we have permitting issue here in the United States, but we don't have them everywhere. But you're able to move infrastructure much faster into the electron world than into the molecule world. And I think that's kind of the danger for oil is you can build fast, and all our forecasts keep moving faster and faster. Not fast enough for 1.5 degrees, but much faster.
Yeah, no, I think 1.5 degrees is sort of probably in the back, in the rear window, as the ducks will tell you, swimming in my street. You mentioned the Chinese, the penetration 40% by 2028, 50% this year. This is where we're talking about? In China only, okay.
This is the largest car market in the world.
Yeah, because one of the things we found is as you said, you know, the cost of solar panels have come down, and I think in the UK they're so cheap that they're actually using them as fences for their gardens because, you know, it's just there's too much of it and not so much demand, because the assumption was that there would be more demand for them. But what I want to keep going back to is how the decarbonisation. I mean, I'm a fellow at the Energy Institute in the UK, and we were last year, the year before actually, we were at the reception after the Energy Week, and the Stop Oil campaigners came, and they let off a stink bomb, a smoke bomb. So of course we had to evacuate in the cold. The whole hotel had to be evacuated, and they're not satisfied with just decarbonising oil. They just want an end. They believe it's all greenwashing if you say you're going to decarb. So is a carbon tax necessary? Is that, I mean, that's something that was left to be debated after COP28. It was not tackled at COP28 because even though the industry says they would like to see a carbon tax, I don't really believe that they really want a carbon tax, or at least, and again, it's who's going to pay for it. You know, it's going to be passed on to consumers. We saw what happened in France with the Gilets jaunes. We're seeing a lot of policy sort of backtracking in the UK, which has, you know, success with wind, with offshore wind, but not so much anything else. It's, again, we have elections coming up, so we'll wait to see. But the permitting issue, you say it's not so much of a issue elsewhere. It is in Europe. I mean, permitting for wind takes about 2 years. They're trying to resolve it, but it seems to me as if there's a lot of optimism. But what I really would like to focus on is how it's impacting the Gulf states, and what are the risks, because they're not all going at the same pace. They're not really coordinating their policies together. So what are the risks if they are sort of left behind? I mean, particularly in countries like Iraq, say, which is so heavily dependent on oil. Countries like Kuwait, which have really not done very much yet to sort of decarbonize or to go the renewables rate. So that's really what I'd like to focus on.
Let's talk about the policy and the impact on the Gulf and how the Gulf is adapting. So on the policy side, I agree with you. I mean, if you're going to make people pay, they're not going to be happy. And I think the debate at the end of the day into the decarbonization transition is the technology that you need to be using needs to be better. It cannot be worse and more expensive, correct? It has to be better and cheaper. And that's that technological leap that we are having right now. And having a real debate about industrial policies in Europe and in the United States and China, and how to manage that and bring on your workforce, your capital, your technology is super important, is the debate of the moment, correct? Is like, what is industrial policy? The U.S. energy transition policy of the Biden administration, in a way, tried to answer some of your question here, is no carbon tax. We're not going to tax people. We're going to create incentives. It's all carrots, no sticks. So we want is to create the demand for the new technology without punishing the old one. The oil and gas industry are doing pretty well in the United States. Oil and gas are at all-time production levels. They're growing. They're not particularly taxed. So there's no sticks on that. Europe is more difficult. They had a major energy crisis. Basically, their secure source of oil and gas got cut off, and it had a big impact on cost. And they had basically to reverse their whole energy strategy in a matter of months. Power prices went through the roof. Government tried to shield some of it, but not all of it. And now that shield is being removed and energy prices are higher. Europe is basically poor in all energy. Hydrocarbons, but also renewables. I mean, the sun is not particularly shiny on the continent. So they have an issue, and how they go about it is not clear. And I think the transition is having a lot of political impact in Europe, and will continue to. And we'll see great progress some places and tracking back, etc. It's not one nice, easy move. The China policy aspect is really important because it's creating also a lot of tension around these industrial policies, because they can really take over sectors. I mean, last year we added something like 500 gigawatt of solar in the world, which is an insane number. You would have told me 3 years ago we'll be at 300. I would have told you this is impossible. And I think we're only using something like 60% of the manufacturing capacity in the world right now. So we have a lot of capabilities to go faster, but there's a limit how much you can install. But it's happening in a lot of places. As we said, solar panel, very cheap. And, you know, a lot of areas in the world are going to get grids which work at night, during the day. And the question is, how do you supplement it? Is it gas? Is it batteries, etc.? Also, by the way, the battery firming the grids is also rising exponentially fast, much faster than anybody thought, in a way, because our manufacturing capability of battery is growing at an incredible pace, etc., etc. So to get to the Gulf, you have countries with very different endowment, both in resources and capital, and capabilities. And you have clearly 3 countries here which are set apart, which is the UAE, Saudi Arabia, and Oman, who have clear strategies. They're different from each other. We can go in detail of them, but they have the capabilities and the means to execute them, and they have the resources. Qatar is more down the line. It's all about gas and decarbonizing gas, but that's, you know, that's what it is. But the UAE have a lot of capital. It started before everybody else. The nuclear project is a big success. The decarbonization, if you want, of the UAE is in a good way. And the nuclear plans just give them so much more capabilities to then add things around it. Decarbonizing their oil and gas is happening, slowly but surely. But also they have the ambition and the capabilities to create companies with regional and global reach, Masdar, Mubadala, ADNOC, which can do things across the world, some with gas, ADNOC, Mubadala acting more like a private equity, and Masdar like a power developer around the region and the world. So they have the sense that these are new technologies. We want to be into this business. We're going to invest in it. It's an area of growth. It's like any other business, and they're very active. Saudi Arabia, slightly different. We'll come back to their oil strategy altogether. slightly different. They are embarking on, I would say, one of the most exciting and important projects in the world, which is the hydrogen in NEOM. It's the only one which is at that scale. And if we can develop it, because you're going to need to do 10, 15, 20 of those to bring down cost, to create a market, to prove the technology, et cetera, et cetera. And having one of that size happening so fast is great. I just regret there's not 10, 15 of them in the world at this scale right now, because that would be the way to move hydrogen a lot faster. So Saudi Arabia is doing its part on the hydrogen side in a way to prove that technology. It's a complicated technology and it's probably a longer term, but in a way we can't accuse them of not being at the forefront of it. They're also moving fast on decarbonizing their electricity grid, moving from oil to gas and adding quite a lot of renewables, starting from about 0 2 years ago. And, you know, within 10 years, I would say maybe half of their grid could be renewable. You can install a lot of solar panels in Saudi Arabia. They have sun and land, which is about the two things you need. And there's plenty of solar panels, and they're going about it. They're doing the same with wind. So they have a strategy there. Oman is more about gas and hydrogen. But for the main country, the question is oil. Correct? So this is their main resources. The reality is these countries have the lower cost, the lowest carbon intense oil. So they will be the last producer. So if the market is 100 million or 80 million or 70 million, I think Saudi Arabia could be producing at exactly the same level because they have the cheapest cost and the least polluting barrel. So they are where they need to be. The question is how you transition the revenue rather than really the future of oil. And again, I think the UAE gonna have escape velocity now. And Saudi Arabia needs a few more years, but I don't see the oil market collapsing in the next 10 years. I don't see Haytham a world happening that nobody's using oil tomorrow or in 5 years or in 10 years. So Saudi Arabia will produce 10 million barrels per day. The question is, at what price? Is it at $80 or $60 or $40? That's the question, and that's what they need to manage rather than the end of oil. They will be the last producer.
Thank you, Roger. I'm going to open it up, but again, you're right. I mean, I think there's a messaging problem. I mean, when people look at the Middle East and the Gulf and they say, oh, you know, you're all about oil, and they forget that actually Aqua Power and Masdar are some of the biggest investors in renewable energy, not just within the region, but beyond. I mean, it's now Africa, it's even the US, it's Europe. So, and of course, the biggest cost in production of green hydrogen is electrolyzers. They're building them on site, Chinese. They're building their own EVs and they're investing in EV technology. So I think it's very unfair to say that they are just about oil. And maybe they started, I mean, in the case of Saudi Arabia, they started a bit late. They changed their target so many times. But things are being done, but they're not really getting that message across. And that image of them as sort of, you know, the oil sheikhs is very difficult to shake off. I'm going to open it up. If anybody has questions for Roger, the experts, please go ahead. Do I see any? No, nobody's got theirs. Oh, sorry. Yes, please go ahead.
We all talked about China and the market there and how it is transitioning towards green energy. I was wondering, you have any comments on India? You know, I've been researching on India a lot. We've just had elections. Prime Minister Modi had a difficult election, and he won. The biggest topic there was jobs and economic growth, and so I believe the question we're asking here is whether I think there's a huge demand for oil even now in India, and the fact that in India there's so much focus on coal. So there are challenges. I was wondering if you can comment a little bit on, and how emerging markets, and especially countries like India, what are the challenges they're facing?
Yeah. Huge challenges in India. So I spoke mostly about three markets, correct? Europe, the US, and China, which represent about 70% of the demand. India is the one which is missing here, and then there's the rest of the world. Just for the rest of the world, we haven't solved anything. We don't have capital. We don't have ways to accelerate the transition. The energy use is very low. So a lot of problems not addressed, not a clear pathway to solve them. There's a lot of talk, but really, I would say no great plans or great conclusion here that things are going to improve fast. We have few good examples. India is in a category apart. In a way, it's the other, the fourth large one. And it's probably the most challenging economy to decarbonize because of the reliance on coal. And coal in India is more than just producing coal, it's the whole economy. And the whole transport system is linked to coal. So if you cut coal, what do you do with your train system? How do you electrolyze it? So it's going to require a lot. And in many ways, this is one area where if there is a global agreement to decarbonize faster, a lot has to be done with India. So India's all of the above, correct? So they're trying to increase the gas consumption pretty fast to try to slow down the coal growth, not declining it yet. Same with renewables, but for renewables in India, you need land, and you don't have that much land, and it's complicated. So you have a lot of challenges in India that will take time, and I think will take a global compact to help solve. I think, in a way, this is one of that element of the geopolitical battle going on here between the US and China is how India fits in, and what are you doing for India to continue to grow and linked to global market and to become potentially your engine for decarbonization. So if you look at big shifts, we're seeing now these new mineral alliance emerging from Australia to the United States, how and where to put manufacturing, refining of the mineral, etc. And India will play an important role in that. But you're right, I think India is probably the most difficult country to decarbonize.
Anybody else? Anybody else have? Yes, please, go ahead.
There we go. Hi, Roger. It's always good. I'm always smarter after I spend some time with you, so thank you for being here today. My question is a question that came up there at the end about the efforts of the Gulf states and these accusations of greenwashing. I mean, I understand, and people in this room understand, the significant efforts that they're making and the significant capital that they have to put behind them, both the UAE with what they're doing, the Saudis with their hydrogen projects. But my question is twofold. One of them is, how do you deal with this issue of greenwashing and this perception of greenwashing? Understand that these are going to be the last states standing in terms of oil production. And for good reasons. The reason why their oil is so expensive also means that it's quite low carbon. Their lifting costs and their energy use are just really low. So how do you somewhat rehabilitate their reputation here and show that these efforts are real? And then the flip side of that question is, how much do we care, really? I mean, short of putting off smoke bombs in hotels and causing problems, like, how much do you need to rehabilitate that image? Like, part of my question is not just how can we, but how much should we worry about it?
Yeah, I don't know, I'm not an image specialist. But, I mean, to a large degree, the UAE managed quite well with the COP28 to rebrand and to emerge as a different set of values and reposition itself. It's spending a lot of money in its companies, correct? So it's really investing, and investing not, I'm not saying it's aid, it's really economic investing. I mean, they're making big technological bets here, and they're willing to spend money. I think Saudi Arabia is in a different place. And again, the debate at COP28, where Saudi Arabia appears like they're the one defending the producers, the polluters, etc., is not greenwashing, correct? They're standing clearly where they feel they need to stand. So they're not particularly aiming at that, and the perception that they're just an oil producer. After all, their transition strategy is more internal, so it will take time, and there will continue to be an oil producer, and I don't think there's much they can do about changing the perception of people who put whatever sting bombs in hotels. I mean, it is what it is. I don't know how you convince them that's what it is, but the reality of the world is we're going to continue to get 10 million barrels per day from Saudi Arabia for a long, long time.
Anybody else? Any other questions? Yeah, please.
On this topic, I guess, tied into it, and I think one of the answers of why it matters is other parts of the sovereign balance sheet are in the markets, and and so maybe for the oil companies it doesn't. But anyway, we might get to that. But I'm interested in where you left off at the end, Roger, on the price. So they'll continue to produce if we're looking out that longer term. But if anything, one of the challenges, I'm just interested in your thoughts of not exactly how we get there, but in this environment now where this preference for a high enough price that prompts investment, which is prompting investment, say, outside of OPEC. And so, again, these transitions are always messy, right? But I'm just interested in your thoughts on the trade-off in the next few years of, what that sort of runway looks like. And I recognize this is a big question we'll be talking about the rest of today, the rest of the few years.
No, you're right. I mean, I said 70, 90 is kind of Goldilocks price for everybody, but for Saudi Arabia, they've been losing market share. And I think when you look at the price of oil, the marginal price of oil, which allows Saudi Arabia to produce at a higher level, is probably $20 lower. So that's the reality, but that's a choice they made, that they're in the middle of a big economic social transformation. They need capital, and they need to manage the oil market. They're trying to have as many allies as possible, but it's getting difficult. So how long can you maintain the price above the marginal price to basically supply the world? And if this is where the demand question is important, because if it's 112 million in 2030 or 104 million, that's a very different price, correct? Because that's another $200 billion. You don't need to be investing in upstream. And if you're keeping prices at 80, 85, it's going to get invested and you're going to get pushed out of the market. So how do you manage that balance is not easy. It will falter at one point, depending on when supply, demand, etc. But we're in a phase where supply is coming hard and strong. I mean, the US, Guyana, Brazil, a little bit everywhere, actually. When you look at non-OPEC, it's done very well the last 3 years. And the element that we don't see, that we all talk about, the growth in the non-OPEC, that we don't talk about, which is the lack of decline everywhere else. At these prices, we don't decline. Correct? That's $500 billion we're spending to maintain the base is really working. So it's difficult. But, you had a crisis here. You get Venezuela barrel out, you get the Iranian barrel out, you get the Russian barrel out at one point. So they managed pretty well. High revenue, pretty high level of production. And I think the last OPEC meeting is reflecting a little bit that, rebalancing the priorities toward market share away from price. They're not trying to get $100 oil. They're trying to stay at 80 and increase their market share. So there is a sense of reality. How it works, I don't think you can plan 5-7 years out. I mean, having been in the business, I think OPEC care about the next quarter, and I'll tell you what their price target is. It's always $5 higher than where it is today. So whatever the price. So that's their price target. That's what they're trying. It's like you're on a bicycle, and from time to time you're going to fall, and you're going to get up and go again. There's no miracle number at which they will be able to manage it. If you want to keep it above 65, that's the game you need to play, and they're doing a pretty decent job. So,
Thank you, Roger. I think we're pretty close to the end, unless there's another question from anybody. No. I think living in the Gulf, I've sort of noticed, if you look at the NDCs of, say, the UAE, they actually say that their man-made islands, of which there are many and there's more coming, are actually under threat from rising sea levels. Water is becoming, there's higher salinity, so desalination is becoming more difficult. Of course, they're switching to reverse osmosis, which is less, a bit more friendly, but still energy intensive. But at the end of the day, I think it's a reality that climate change is actually having an impact, and it's not just ducks swimming; it's dengue fever emerging. It's they're now trying to protect the shorelines in the UAE because they realise that if the ice cap starts melting thousands of miles away up in Greenland, it's actually going to have an impact on their climate. They're trying to become more self-sufficient in food, and of course the UAE is an example of where you have got nuclear power, which has meant less consumption of gas, but that's not being replicated anywhere else. I think Egypt is going to be the next one, but again, you're not going to be able to get to that net zero without nuclear, without maybe small modular units. You're going to have to just really invest in so many different technologies, and again, we're talking about going from billions to trillions, and I think that's going to be the biggest challenge, and we're going to be talking about that in the investment. So I thank you all for listening, and Roger, thank you so much for your insights, and we'll be carrying on talking about gas and the end or not the end of oil in the next session. So.